Hey everybody, what's going on? It is James here with Crypto Common Sense, and I wanted to sit down today, October 9th, 2025, because recently I read an article, and in that article, an implication was made that if you are not investing in Bitcoin, you are missing the boat because Bitcoin is outperforming all the other assets, including the stock market, etc., etc., etc. Not only is that not true across the board, but in some cases, investing in Bitcoin was one of the biggest mistakes you can make compared to other assets. So the first chart we're going to take a look at is simply an empty chart or mostly empty chart of Bitcoin versus the QQQ. Because again, there was an idea or, a thesis put forth that investing in Bitcoin vastly outperformed investing in stocks. And the reality, as you can see from this chart, is it really depends on when you invested in Bitcoin. If you invested in Bitcoin, for example, at the bottom of 2022's bear market, yes, Bitcoin has drastically outperformed the QQQ. In fact, we can look here, it's up about 250%. So it was a much better investment than QQQ in October of 2022, for example, or November, anytime through this area. But on the flip side, had you invested in Bitcoin a few weeks ago or a few months ago, the QQQ has actually outperformed Bitcoin. Bitcoin is worth less today than it was a few months ago. And in reality, if we zoom out and look at this objectively, Bitcoin is worth just barely more today than it was at the top of March of 2021 versus the QQQ. In other words, your returns, if you invested back here in Bitcoin and invested in QQQ, would have been roughly the same. But that's comparing Bitcoin, which is a single asset, to an entire asset class of or a basket of stocks of the QQQ. And really, this article did something even more nefarious. They compared Bitcoin to the SPY, which is not a fair assessment because the SPY is made up of value stocks and not growth stocks. It's not meant to be the best performing. It's meant to be one of the more conservative investments in equities. But even with that being said, the same thing applies. Today, Bitcoin is only up about 14% over its high in 2021. So investing in both of them would depend on when you invested, whether or not it was a good idea. Now, I'm willing to concede that overall, Bitcoin has outperformed the SPY over the last, decade that it's been in existence. Same thing is true for the QQQ. Over the last decade, it has outperformed the QQQ as a whole. But let's go deeper. Let's look at Bitcoin versus money supply, which gives a more, grounded view of how Bitcoin is actually performing. And what we see is that Bitcoin today is actually only up about 16 to 18% over its all-time high in December of 2017, which actually means that Bitcoin is not performing near as impressively as some people want you to believe. But again, overall, it has performed well versus money supply. I concede that fact with no argument whatsoever. My problem with articles and with opinions that make it sound like if you don't invest in Bitcoin that you're just, going to be up a creek without a paddle is it's cherry picking data. You're taking an asset that has been one of the best performing assets of the last 10 years in what may ultimately be one global bull market. And then you're saying that it's basically the new end all be all. People should put all their money in that one basket. But if you look at any super performing asset in history that later crashed or went horrifically wrong, they always have those periods where they look untouchable. And if we take a look at Bitcoin and we do compare it to what I think is the new market darling, which is an AI stock, we're going to find out that money has actually been shuffling away from cryptocurrency and into AI related technologies. So here is a Bitcoin chart measured not in US dollars, not in money supply, and not in QQQ or SPY, but measured side by side with NVIDIA. And now what we're going to see is a very telling picture, because not only is Bitcoin performing very, very poorly currently versus NVIDIA, historically speaking, if we look back over the last 14 years, we're going to find out that the majority of the time, you would have been better off to have invested in NVIDIA stock than you would have been to invest in Bitcoin. In fact, Bitcoin today is worth roughly the same as it was for a short amount of time in 2013. There's only 3 periods where you would have been better off to buy Bitcoin versus NVIDIA. Now, if that's confusing to some people, there's an easier way to look at this. We can actually measure NVIDIA. Instead of taking it and saying how many dollars is one share of NVIDIA worth, we can say how many Bitcoins is one share of NVIDIA worth. And we get a chart that looks like this. And what we're going to find out is that NVIDIA stock has been increasing in value against Bitcoin going on 4 years now. In fact, again, we can go all the way back to 2017. If you invested in Bitcoin at any point after August of 2017, instead of investing in NVIDIA, your returns are smaller than what they would have been. That's not to say that Bitcoin is bad or Bitcoin is evil or Bitcoin is, a fraud or anything of that nature. It's simply to say that when we cherry pick data, it's very easy to find data that fits our thesis. My thesis is that AI stocks are the new darling of the market, that investors are more excited about investing in artificial intelligence than they are about investing in cryptocurrency. I personally believe that has taken a lot of the wind out of cryptocurrency sales, and it's the reason that we didn't hit those higher numbers that I was expecting in this cycle, even as high as $200,000. It doesn't mean that it can't still happen, but I do think it's extremely important that people step back and realize there is a new contender in the space that is fighting very hard for people's hard-earned dollars. And again, that contender is AI. If we start looking at other charts, such as Bitcoin versus the Magnificent Seven, what we'll find is a chart that looks like this. This essentially represents what appears to be a distribution pattern after a bull market dating back to the invention of Bitcoin itself. We're moving sideways, and when I look at this objectively, what I notice is volume is starting to fall off. This does look like, a buying climax followed by signs of weakness, which is Wyckoff theory. It looks like an upthrust, and this certainly looks like an upthrust after distribution to me, which means that when I look at this, this makes me believe the same thing that I just said, which is money is rotating away from cryptocurrency and into the Mag 7. And the Mag 7 are heavily pushed by the idea of AI and their investments in AI and what they're going to be doing with AI within their companies. So be careful buying into narratives that say that Bitcoin is the best performing asset, because it all depends on what time frame you're looking at. Right now, Bitcoin is far from the best performing asset. And to make this even clearer for anybody that doesn't quite understand how these relative strength charts work, I can show you a very simple picture. If we look at Bitcoin and we look at where it's at right now at 121,000, if I had bought Bitcoin at the exact bottom in 2022 and I was still holding that Bitcoin, I would be up about 684. We're going to round it up about 700%, which is incredible. But if I'd have bought NVIDIA at that exact same low in October of 22 and I was still holding NVIDIA, I would be up roughly 1,700%. In other words, I would be up more than twice as much if I had invested in NVIDIA instead of investing in Bitcoin. Again, this is cherry-picked data showing that NVIDIA outperformed Bitcoin. You don't want to use cherry-picked data for anything. You don't want to look at Bitcoin over the last 10 years and say, well, it's outperformed a lot of stocks and therefore it has to always do that. You don't want to look at NVIDIA today and say, well, it's outperformed Bitcoin. It always has to do that. You want to realize that in markets, most money doesn't leave the market. It simply moves between assets or asset classes. You have the same general amount of money just kind of sloshing around the market to different sectors as investors are chasing gains and chasing the biggest returns. For a long time, those biggest returns were indeed happening inside of the cryptocurrency market. But I believe firmly that those days are over and AI has stolen Bitcoin's thunder. So be careful about buying into narratives that paint pictures that are not backed up by data. As always, please remember that I am just some guy sitting in a spare bedroom. Nothing in this video is financial advice. You should always go out and do your own due diligence and seek out professional financial advice from a licensed financial advisor before making any type of investment in cryptocurrency, the stock market, precious metals, Forex, or any other tradable asset. Please give the video a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel. Please leave me a comment with your thoughts. And as always, please remember to trade safe.